Okay, so welcome to this webinar on migrating from React Native to React Native, conducted by 99x Technology. I am Janitha Ranavansa. I have been a mobile developer for nearly 7 years now, and today in this webinar I'm going to share my experience in developing applications using React Native as opposed to native. So let's get started with this session. I don't exactly have any coding demonstration prepared. This is going to be mainly a discussion on why you need to move into React Native and how you should do it properly so that you don't end up in any undesired circumstances. So let's go ahead with the presentation. All right, so first of all, why would you need to move into React Native development? So there are key reasons several people are talking about these days. Mainly if the company that you're working for, or if you're an independent developer and you are on strict budget, you might not have the necessary finances to have several developers or have several development machines. So in that case, React Native might be a very good option for you to consider. The other reason is that for small companies, if you don't have enough resources as well, if you have a small team and you need to complete somewhat large-scale applications within a very short period of time, then in that case as well, the React Native would be a very viable option. And like I said, limited resources. If you don't have enough computers to develop applications, if you can't support several developers for each platform that you are developing the application for, mainly Android and iOS, going ahead with React Native might be a very good option. But more than that, from my experience, what I have noticed is that React Native, the benefits that the React Native platform would give are greater than that, and the scope that the React Native can accomplish for you is greater than just the resources and the limitations of budgets. So the main 4 points that I would like to consider, or rather point out to you guys, is that when developing with React Native technology, you would have a significant reduced feature turnover time. This is mainly because what you are writing is just one code base, and that is going to be compiled to both Android and iOS. The other main point is that the increased manageability. So for instance, if you consider an application which is developed by your company or by yourself for Android and iOS, and you need to have some certain feature sets developed for both platforms. If you have two different development teams, you need to have the both teams in sync when it comes to features and all the other improvements. So this is going to be a kind of a tedious task depending on the project size and the number of people that are involved in the project. So if you have just one code base, it is going to be much more easier for you to manage the project. The other one is that the code reusability. So here now, since we are running less code in React Native projects, the components that we write could be reused within the application itself over and over again, or we could use those components in other projects as well. So if we compare the differences where we have the native applications on Android and iOS as opposed to the same components set on React Native, if we try to reuse the components again in another project for iOS and Android, we have to do the same thing twice because two platforms. But in React Native, it's just the one component that we have. So it is much more easier for you to migrate the new components into the new project. The other one is code testability. Again, since we have just one code base and it's a very manageable code base, the code would be much more easier for you to test. And that would ensure that if you have very good test units written, if the test units pass and you have good coverage, then it will ensure that your application is running on iOS and Android platform both the expected way. So, right, so I would like to explore on these options a bit more. So, reduce feature turnover time. So, I hope that most of you know by now that in React Native, the code base that you're writing is basically JavaScript, and that JavaScript code is going to be run on both Android and iOS equally. So, if you have a feature that you need to develop, as opposed to writing it on native Android or iOS, if you write it on React Native, the same feature would be available at the same time for both platforms. So in this case, the feature turnover time will be very less. And most of the time, the code that you're running on a React Native project would be on JavaScript. So I would say 99% of the time, you would just write the JavaScript code for that particular business requirement, and you would be ready to deploy that on Android and iOS both. But you need to keep in mind that React Native is a very basic platform. So once you start a React Native project, if you need to add in more features later on, then there would be the requirement that you need to utilize third-party libraries. So in this case, depending on your business requirements, you might need to explore on what third-party libraries are available and see the feasibility of those. So, increase manageability. So, like I briefly mentioned previously, if you have one React Native project that is basically outputting in the application that you want to develop, the team management would be very less, because you don't have to talk between the iOS team, Android team back and forth and see the differences and try to manage the differences between the two platforms. So it is going to be much more easier for you to deal with React Native projects as project managers. So code reusability, like I mentioned before briefly, this is one of the key points of using React Native projects in your company, because once you have written good components in your application, and if you are developing a similar application, it's just a matter of importing the correct files into the project that you are developing afterwards and just get on with it. As well as JavaScript code testability. So most of the business logic would be written on JavaScript, and if you have very good tests in place, it's going to be much more easier for you to do good code coverage on your project and then ensure the application is working as expected. Right. So we have these reasons. So we could just go ahead and convert our applications to React Native projects. So whatever the new applications that we are going to start, we could just do it in React Native. From my experience, that is not the case. So for those who are willing to or want to get into React Native development, there are certain things that I would want you to consider before getting into React Native, and how you would want to get into React Native. So there are plenty of guides on the internet talking about how to start a React Native project and carry on. But most of these projects, most of these videos or tutorials, they would talk about how would you get started, but not exactly how you would keep on managing the application. So in this case, from my experience, I would like to talk about several different pointers of how you should consider getting into React Native development. So, before anyone forgets, it is very important that you need to keep in mind that React Native is still a beta product, even though it is not called a beta product, because React Native started gaining momentum only about a couple of years ago, and everyone started suddenly talking about it because everyone saw the benefits at the same time, and the benefits are very great. So don't forget that when you're getting into React Native, it's still in its infancy. So it's not a very powerful framework as Android and iOS combined. And it keeps on evolving. So there are several main versions of React Native which was released within this year, which sort of pushed the platform to greater heights. And with these advancements, we tend to come across a lot of changes, especially breaking changes. So you need to keep in mind that when you start working on a React Native project, 1 or 2 months down the line, the React Native platform would have progressed by a couple of versions, and you need to keep in mind that these things have happened and things might have changed. So React Native, in essence, is a very basic framework, but it's very powerful. So for those who don't know about what is happening when you are doing a React Native project, basically the JavaScript that you are writing would go through a bridge on each of the platforms, and then that would convert your components or elements, screen elements, into native components on that particular platform. So that's why we get certain performance advantage in terms of UI in a React Native application as opposed to a hybrid application like Ionic. So, and React Native would have a learning curve. So you need to be prepared for that. You can't just get on with React Native, start a project and carry on with your project. So allow yourself some time to gain your knowledge in React Native and then progress slowly. And the last point is that the React Native platform is not fully fledged. Not everything is doable in React Native as of now. So you need to keep that in mind as well before you get on with the React Native project. So React Native, now if we discuss about how it came about. So at Facebook, the developers were exploring the idea of developing mobile applications sooner than what they were doing now, the time period that they are using to develop features. So that's how they wanted to come up with a technology in order to develop this React Native technology, so that you could just write the code base once and then develop into Android and iOS applications. So in this case, React Native sort of have united the two worlds between web developers and mobile developers. Before React Native, web developers didn't have a very good way of creating mobile applications. The only way that they had was through frameworks like Ionic. But everyone knows that this application didn't perform well. So for web developers, React Native has solved this problem. For mobile developers, those who have been doing mobile development for several years or who have started their career with mobile development, with the recent advancements of React framework and Node.js, it is kind of desirable that you need to get into web development as well. So React Native sort of paves a path for that as well for the mobile developers. So if you are a good developer in React Native, I would say you have, to a certain extent, you have covered all these three platforms: Android, web, and iOS. Right. So, actually, if you want to be a React Native developer, what would you need? You would need these things. Definitely, you would need JavaScript knowledge, because the project that you are going to work on is going to be written in JavaScript, and knowing ES6 Plus would be an advantage. And then definitely React development. For web developers, those who have already gained the React knowledge and have JavaScript skills, you would want to look into the Android framework as well as the iOS frameworks, because all these four components are combined within a React Native application. So you can't just know the JavaScript part of it and then hope to develop an application for Android or iOS. And if you are a native applications developer for Android or iOS, you can't just assume to develop a React Native application for Android and iOS using JavaScript without knowing the JavaScript knowledge as well as the React Native knowledge. Right, so let's assume that for someone who has the JavaScript knowledge, the React knowledge, the Android SDK knowledge, iOS SDK knowledge, so how would you go about doing a React Native application? So these are the things that I would like to point out very clearly. Before you get on to a React Native project, you need to understand your business requirements. So first of all, go through the business requirements and see what are the things that need to be done, and see that the possibilities of doing that or achieving those business requirements in React Native. Because a lot of people nowadays, they just want to get into React Native application development, and then later down the line they realize that they have this particular business requirement, but it can't exactly be done on React Native. So they tend to go into a dead end. So before going into a project, understand your business requirements, isolate them, and then see if each of those cases could be achieved using React Native. So I mentioned before that React Native is a very basic library. So most of the stuff that you would want to do in React Native would not be able to do without the help of libraries. So for React Native, there are plenty of libraries. There are plenty of open source libraries out there. React Native itself is open source. So once you start your research on how to achieve your business requirements, you would run into so many different options. But what I would suggest is that focus your efforts on, first of all, UI UX. There are plenty of UI UX libraries out there. So see what suits you best. And then the navigation. The navigation that comes with React Native. By navigation, what I mean here is that from navigating from one screen to the other, having tabbed navigations within your application, drawer navigations, things like that. What comes with React Native by default isn't that great. So you need to explore your options on navigations as well. So there's a couple of different libraries quite famous, React Navigation as well as React Native Navigation. Look at both the libraries and see what suits your application requirements the best and which is more performant for you. Because depending on the implementation and how you would want to do things in your application, one library might perform better than the other library. And the other thing is data persistence. For a React Native application, data persistence is not out of the box. So you need to explore your options of data persistence as well. If you need to get involved some kind of a database, or you could just use the async storage on React Native and then just be happy with it. And the other thing is state management. So with React, it comes by default that Redux is a library that you must use for state management. For those who are not very clear about state management is basically the idea of that your application state would be stored in one place, and the application UI components would subscribe to these states, and then they would reflect the changes in the state as the lifetime of the application progresses. So Redux is a very popular option. RealmDB is a popular option. So explore those ideas as well and see how you could do state management in application in a more manageable way based on your business requirements. So for other things, other business requirements like using the camera, file upload, download, storage, permissions, for things like that, you need to look into third-party components as well. So there are plenty of options available. Just do your initial research on this and see what suits you best and which has the most support in the community. Because everything related to React Native is open source and it is driven by the community. So you need to be sure about including the components that you want to include in the component in your application is up to the standards that you're looking for. Right, so I talked about Redux. One other thing that would like to point out is that when you are doing this initial research into React Native development, you would come across the term Redux quite a lot. So what I would suggest is that don't get ahead of yourself, because most of the time Redux would be needed in order to manage the state of your application. But it is important that you need to understand that state management is going to be cumbersome when your application grows. So until a certain point within your application's development lifecycle, Redux won't be necessary unless you need to sort of develop a very complex application. You would come across things like Redux Thunk, Redux Saga, Observable, Promises, middleware. So all of these things would later come down the road, but don't go ahead of yourself and try to integrate these things into your application, because without realizing what they would achieve for your application and trying to integrate them into your application, you would sort of run into a bottleneck. So be familiar with React Native platform first, and be familiar with what it can do. And then once the requirement comes only, look into Redux and try to integrate the Redux framework into your application. As well as don't exactly worry about components versus pure components. I know a lot of people, as soon as they start, they want to have good performance within their applications, and the first thing that they come across is converting their components into pure components. What I would suggest is that if you are comfortable with developing with components, just go ahead and develop with components. It is good that if you start doing it with pure components, but if you are not comfortable with using pure components, just go ahead with and use components. Right. Yeah, so finally, you have all of these. You know your business requirements. You know your business requirements. You have the particular knowledge regarding React Native, Android framework, and you know the libraries as well. Right. So getting started with actual React Native development. So you could develop a React Native application both on Mac and Windows. But for obvious reasons, you can't develop iOS applications on Windows. So because of that, you need to use Mac computer. And there are plenty of IDEs out there. What I would recommend is VS Code. VS Code has been sort of out of developers' view for quite some time, but during the past 1 year or so, it has gained a lot of momentum and it has improved a lot. And a lot of the people are using VS Code. There are dedicated application development environments for React Native itself. If you are not very comfortable with just writing the code, you may use those as well. And then there are two other popular options of creating React Native applications. One is in Expo, the other one is building React Native applications with native code. So what here by building with native code, what I mean is React Native init. That is a command line tool that is available for you to create React Native projects, which would pre-configure the React Native project to a certain state that so you could just start developing your application. Right, so once you have that as well, and then you are doing the React Native development. So you have written a couple of components, and eventually you're going to come across this render method problem. The problem is that once the props and the state changes in your React Native application, each time that happens, your components it's going to call render method. And this is one of the pain points in React Native development. So you need to ensure that your components should only render only when they have to. So if you are using components, you might have to resort to using should component update method. Or if you are using pure components, a lot of things are handled for you, but you need to be careful that the objects that you provide to your pure component stay pure. So this is a term that you are going to come across in React Native development as well, pure objects. Pure objects is basically what it means is that if you have a complex JavaScript object and you do some manipulation to it and send it to a component, the component wouldn't recognize the change and it wouldn't re-render itself. So what they mean by pure objects is that every time you do a change to an existing object, what you need to do is you need to deconstruct it and then do the necessary changes and construct a new object and then send it to the component. And then in that way, pure components would know that the particular object has changed, and then it would re-render itself with the new data. Right. So up to this point, you have only used components and pure components in your application, and there comes a point in your development lifecycle where you need to use a third-party library. So if you have identified several different libraries that you need to use within your application, what I would suggest is that don't go ahead and include all of them at once. First of all, isolate that business requirement and create a proof of concept. This is basically another temporary React Native project, so that you know your way around the library and how it integrates into your code, and the capabilities of the library and the pain points of integrating the library. Because if you are doing a React Native application with native code integrated in it, later down the line you might come across certain errors in terms of Android or iOS. So you need to be sure that the library integrates with JavaScript code perfectly as you expect it to, and then from that point onwards you could evaluate how it would integrate with your project code. So always isolate each and every node module that you are going to integrate into your application. Do a proper evaluation of it, and then once you're confident, then integrate that into your working project. Right. Now, the other thing I mentioned in the second slide, that React Native keeps evolving. So as you start developing your application, React as well as React Native, both these frameworks would get updated and they would introduce breaking changes. Or sometimes they could just have something that is undesirable for you and things might break. So when you start React Native, for example, let's say version X and there's version X plus 1, just don't go ahead and upgrade it to version X plus 1. Always see what are the changes in the React as well as React Native frameworks, and see if there are any specific things that has been mentioned as breaking bugs. So be prepared for those things and then do the upgrade and expect those certain things to break. And what I would suggest, the other thing is that if you have several libraries already integrated, third-party components with native code, in that case a lot of people just npm upgrade and then all of these components would get updated and would run into so many different problems in terms of native code. One thing that you need to keep in mind is that since React Native involves JavaScript code as well as native code, a lot of the errors that you would get is not very straightforward. So you need to understand what these errors means, and a lot of the native libraries would tend to throw out very advanced errors. So if you are not very familiar with the Android framework or iOS framework and not with JavaScript, sometimes you might have a very difficult time trying to understand these errors. So don't do any npm upgrade and update all of the libraries that is included in your application. Upgrade them each one by one and see if they introduce any breaking changes to your application. And if you have 10 libraries, if you do this 10 times over, upgrading one library at a time, and see if there are any breaking changes, then by the end of it, you would be much more comfortable that your application has successfully upgraded, rather than worrying about what might would have broken down somewhere else where you have not tested properly. Right. So how would you ensure that your code is always working the proper way that you expect it to? So what I would suggest is that everyone who is getting into React Native development, start using prop types and jest from day one. If you don't have tests in place, once you do an upgrade or once you do a drastic change into some of your components or decompose some of your components, you would run into so many problems in terms of breaking functionality. So from day one, try to use prop types and jest. Both of these prop types is basically it is a way of ensuring that your component gets the data in the correct format that it expects it to, in the correct type. And jest is the testing framework that comes with React Native. So both of these are very easy to learn. The documentation is very descriptive. Prop types documentation is very simple. It's easier for you to understand. And just by looking at the code, you could understand what it means. So it's not very difficult to get into both of these. Jest is very robust, and there are so many ways that you could test your code using jest. So what I would suggest is that get started with a simple test in your application, basically starting ahead with a helper class or a util class. And then as you progress, you would gain knowledge on how to do things in jest, and you would come across new problems and new ways to test things in jest in your application. So you would automatically just advance through how to test your application properly. So like I mentioned, both of these comes with React Native. So if you do React Native init, if you use that command line tool, that would set up prop types and just for you, so you don't have to do anything. You can just start creating your components and application, and then start using prop types and just within the components. Right. So once you have started developing, once you are comfortable with the libraries, the components, how you are doing the React Native development, actual development, how are you going to progress? How are you going to gain knowledge on React Native? So I mentioned that React Native is open source and it has a very good community. So many developers are getting into React Native, and so many developers are curious about what React Native can do and trying to push the boundaries. So what I would suggest is that one of my main sources of knowledge for React Native is actually Facebook communities. There are several good communities out there. So many people post different questions, different libraries, different modules that they produce for React Native and trying to solve different problems. So if you could just Google, search on Facebook for React communities, React Native communities. So the other thing, don't forget about React as well, because React Native is built on top of React Native. So if you have most of the things that you would come across in terms of components and things like that, lifecycle methods, they come from React. So don't forget about the fact that React is part of React Native. So pay attention to React communities as well. And there are plenty of videos on YouTube on how to do things. Medium is a very good source. I have learned so many things in terms of React Native and how to manage the development cycle in a better way through Medium articles. And subscribe to the React Native tag on Stack Overflow, because people are posting questions. Even though you don't understand the question, just read those questions and look at the answers, or how to people try to resolve certain issues, because it is guaranteed that some point down the line you would come across these problems as well. So having read those questions and comments, you might have a good idea by the time that you are going to get into that problem that you would have read these questions on Stack Overflow. Reddit has a community as well. It is not very strong, but people are very active. So you could post questions on Reddit as well. And there are online courses and books. One thing you need to keep in mind is that, like I mentioned before, React and React Native is evolving very rapidly. So most of the online courses and books might refer to outdated content. So in that case, what you would learn out of this material would not be ideal for your scenario, but nonetheless, it's knowledge that you could gain in terms of React and React Native. So if you could afford these things, just go ahead with them. Right. So I would like to talk about the elephant in the room, Airbnb. So Airbnb quite recently discarded using React Native within their application, and because of this, most of the application developers as well as companies who were trying to get into React Native development has sort of stepped back. And I have this conversation on forums as well with different people, especially marketing people, because marketing people don't exactly understand the technology aspect of it. So Airbnb is a very popular company, and they were sort of an advocate for React Native. And so when they abandoned React Native, marketing people sort of got scared, and they said that most of them decided that it's not a very feasible technology and they should stick with native applications development. So there's a popular article on Medium, Sunsetting React Native. It's a 5-part series. I would encourage you to go ahead and read all of those and try to understand the specific problems that the Airbnb team had. And you need to keep in mind that Airbnb adapted React Native technology back in 2015. And so 2015 is 3 years ago, and so many things have changed in React Native after that. So their requirements were so robust and so critical, because for them the mobile application was absolutely the core of their business model. So because of that, what they did was they forked React Native, and then they were developing features on top of React Native, and then they were pushing those features to the React Native team. So they were pushing the boundaries of React Native platform, and they came across unique problems that I would say not all of us would come into. So I would highly suggest that just go ahead and read these articles and see the problems that they have. So if you by this time, if you have identified your business requirements, you would clearly know the difference between the business requirements that you have and what Airbnb had. So in that case, you would be, at least it would be a comforting fact that if you know that these are the problems that Airbnb had, and because of that they abandoned React Native and go ahead from that point. Right. So I would like to talk about some of these stats. In the introduction, I mentioned that I have been a mobile applications developer for 7 years, and I have been doing native mobile applications development for Android and iOS throughout my 7 years of the career. Before that, I was web developer, so I had certain knowledge in terms of JavaScript. So what I'm doing at the moment is basically I have ported a native application which was done for Android and iOS into React Native quite recently. I just got into React Native development just last year, and this year by November 1st I was done with my application, completely rewriting an application from React Native. 4 years worth of code base for iOS and Android in just one platform in React Native within less than a year. So that's quite an achievement. And at the moment, I'm only doing JavaScript code writing. A lot of people think that since Android and iOS is involved in a React Native application, you would have to write Java code as well as Objective-C code or Swift code. But that is not the case. If you have your native modules integrated properly into your application, and if you don't have any specific requirements that could not be fulfilled with whatever the libraries that is available out there, then in that case you might have to write Java code or Objective-C code. But once you have everything properly set up, mainly what you would write is JavaScript code. And these days all I'm writing is just JavaScript code, even though what I'm outputting is basically an Android application and an iOS application. And the other biggest advantage is that when you are doing React Native development, the changes that you do to the code, you could see in less than 3 seconds. So that is quite powerful in terms of saving development time. Because if you are doing an application in Android Studio or Xcode, you know that if you do a change, you need to compile it, build it, and then port the changes to the simulator or your device, and see the changes on the device. So in React Native, if you have dual screen setup, you could just have one screen dedicated to your code and the other one for your emulator or device's mirror image. And you could just update the code then and there, and you could see the changes. So I have a short demo which I could show to you guys, which would demonstrate this capability. Right. The other thing is that 99% of the time, the code that I write, I only have the iOS simulator opened up when I'm doing the development, because frankly, it's only because it is less memory consuming for my development machine. So whatever the code that I write, whatever the changes that I do, I see it on the iOS simulator. Those changes, by the end of the day, when I port the code into changes into the Android device, it would work the same way. So that is another advantage. And I haven't used Android Studio in a long time, mainly because most of the build process that I'm doing in the command line. So there is absolutely no need for me to open up Android Studio at all. The other one is Xcode. That is also when I'm working on a feature and I have completed that and I need to send out a build only, I am using Xcode. At the moment, I'm trying to port that functionality into command line as well, so that I would never have to open up Android Studio or Xcode at all. So these are the advantages of doing React Native development. Your development process would automatically get very efficient and fast. Right, so let's say that you're a developer who has come up to this point, and you would wonder about the future of the React Native as a platform. So there is a React developer, React and React Native developer roadmap, which is available on the documentations and blogs on Facebook. I would suggest for you to look at those and see where they are headed. At the moment, they are doing some significant refactoring for React Native platform to improve performance. So these things, they update the user base monthly. So pay attention to those and have a good eye on these changes in the roadmap. And the other thing is, I would like to also look at TensorFlow. This is a very advanced library and it's a very advanced topic, but if you are worried about the future, everyone nowadays is talking about machine learning and AI. So if you are worried about being a React Native developer for the next 2-3 years and missing out on AI or AI or machine learning, well, have a look at TensorFlow as well, and then you would know that the capabilities of machine learning and AI could be integrated into your React Native application using TensorFlow. Right. So, in summary, what we have discussed is that how you should get into React Native development and how you should avoid the pitfalls. So, if you follow my recommendations, I'm talking with my experience. So, if you follow these recommendations, you would have less problems and you would be up and running with your React Native application quite soon. So what I would suggest is that don't use Expo, go ahead with React Native init, command line tool. And if you are an independent developer, focus on JavaScript, React, Android, and iOS. Know all of these things, because eventually down the line you would come across, at least the building tools, you would come across certain problems that you need to resolve. And having knowledge of these platforms and how especially Gradle build system works as well would help you. For companies, if you need to get into React Native development, assemble a bunch of people who are proficient in JavaScript, Android, and iOS, and develop on a Mac machine. For obvious reasons, you can't put out an iOS application on Windows. But from my experience, I have done development work in both Android and Windows and Mac. But Mac platform has complained less in terms of build errors. So I would suggest go ahead with Mac. Use VS Code. It's a very lightweight development tool and very robust. You could integrate plugins to that and customize it however you want. And focus on creating test suites from day one. It is quite easy that your application would get complex very soon, and you would break down your components into smaller components for reusability or whatever the purpose. So having test suites in that case would be helpful, and getting into jest is very simple. So focus on that. If you have a problem with React Native, don't try to mitigate those issues by ignoring them. Whatever the problem that you have, take them one by one. It's a very new platform, so there are things to be there tend to be things that would break eventually once in a while, so take one problem at a time. And the other important thing is be active in the community. Even though you wouldn't contribute much to the community, there's so much that you could learn from the community. So be active in the community as well. Right. So I also have a short demo of how my day-to-day development works in React Native. So I have a short video prepared. So here what I have is a brand new React Native project we created using React Native init tool. On the far left you could see the Android simulator. On the right you see the iOS simulator and then the VS Code. So here what I'm doing is basically I'm adding a new text component into the application. Yeah. So what I have done is I have added a text component underneath Migrating to React Native demo. So what I have done is I have done the changes, and both of these emulators are running in what is called as live mode, which is a feature in React Native where the application is listening to the changes in the code, and as soon as the changes are done to the code and committed, which means saved in the file, they would be reflected on the devices. So that was immediate. The feedback that you could get is instantaneous for both platforms. So you can't achieve this in native development application environment. I have added this function into this add function. I have passed in two parameters, one. So that function comes from the helper method that I have created. So here's the function. It only does a very simple thing. It just adds the two numbers and returns it. And I have written a simple test for that as well. So in React Native, the tests go into this test folder, which I have highlighted at the moment. So if you have a test if you need to create test for the helper.js file, just create a test file called helper.test.js and put the tests in there. So this is how just looks like. This is a very basic test, but nonetheless, it's a very important test that you should do. So here what is happening is I'm importing the add function into the just file, and then I'm giving it a particular scenario to test out and see if the result is okay. So in this case, I'm just passing 1 plus 1, and I'm expecting it to be 2. Right. So at the bottom in the terminal, what I'm doing is I'm running the test. So in the emulators, I mentioned previously that they are running on the live mode, which is basically listening to the code changes and then refreshing themselves. So basically the changes that you do to the UI or in terms of other things, they would be reflected immediately. And here yarn test -- watch. What this would do is this particular command line tool would keep on watching at my tests, and if there are any changes to my code or my test suite, it would rerun the tests and give me a result. So it might take some time here since it is the initial run, but within a matter of 3 seconds here within a matter of seconds you could get a response from the test suite. So in this case my test has passed. So this is the current development scenario that I'm working on. I basically have the emulators running on live mode as well as the tests looking at the changes in my files and running the necessary tests. So if you come in the morning and do some changes to your code, let's say for example I break this function by adding just 1. I see the immediate changes on the emulators on the left. 1 plus 1 is 3 in this instance, which is incorrect. I see the results. But most of the time, people wouldn't have unit tests. In this case, this would go into your production. But if you have the test, that would get executed instantly as well, and it would immediately let me know that there is something wrong with the code, which is exactly happening here. So here you can see that within a matter of seconds, you are developing for iOS, Android, as well as you are running the tests, and you are ensuring that the application code is running as expected. So I would do another change. I would go ahead and change the component. In this case, the test should succeed, as well as the UI should update immediately. 2 plus 2 is 4. And the test pass, because I haven't broken anything in terms of that function. So this is the advantage of React Native. The feature turnover time and how you could develop, how fast you could develop, and how fast you could get feedback from your devices in the UI as well as from your test cases. It happens now. I know this is a very simple project, but the project that I'm working on is quite complex, and even in that project, the tests and everything runs within a matter of 5 seconds. So I would have immediate feedback on the things that are happening, and by the end of the day, if I'm done with the feature, I could just ship out the APK and the IPA to the app stores. It's as easy as that. So this is the power of React Native, and this is the importance that you need to evaluate your opportunities in React Native and see what it can do. But up to this point, what I have discussed is that how you should do it in proper way, so that you could avoid the pitfalls. Right. So that's the end of this presentation. I hope you guys have learned something out of this. Certainly that you guys are comfortable with getting into React Native development, and if you have any plans of getting into React Native development, do keep in mind the points that I have discussed in these slides, and certainly these are out of my experience. So I have come across a lot of problems in terms of getting into React Native development. I came across a lot of errors. I had to learn ES6 plus, as well as how certain errors are popping up on iOS and Android and how to deal with them. So it's quite important that you need to focus on those things. But once you get through those hurdles, once you're comfortable with everything, once everything is set up in tip-top condition, like I mentioned in the previous slide, your development efforts would go from hours to minutes, without a doubt. Right, it's time for the questions. So if you guys have any questions, do fire them off. I have Right, so we have several questions from the viewers. Right, so Senel has asked the usage of Expo. So, well, Expo is sort of a framework that you could use to develop React Native applications. I mentioned 2 different ways that you could do, and even if you go into the React Native development documentation, the very first thing that they discuss about is this. You could create an application in Expo as well as using the React Native init command line tool. The difference here is that if you create a project in Expo only, that would come with a pre-configured set of libraries which is available to Expo, and it has many libraries integrated, and all you would need to focus on is writing JavaScript code and not worry about developing or including any of the applications, any of the modules into your code. So for example, if you create 2 projects in Expo and create React init, let's say you wanted to use Google Maps in your application. Out of the box, Expo doesn't support this functionality. So in that case, you would have, because why it doesn't support this is because you would have to involve native code in your application, and with Expo you can't do that. It sort of lives within the Expo framework. So that is why they have a function called Expo eject. In that case, you would have to eject your Expo application from that Expo platform and then integrate the native Google Maps functionality into your application. But from day one, if you're using React Native init command line tool to create projects, that would output two native Android and iOS projects, as well as the React Native necessary React Native stuff, so that you could later down the line don't have to eject anything. You could just integrate the native code into your application. So that is the difference between using Expo and React Native init. So Nishan is asking, there is a trend. Asking about the trend and how long React Native would last. My experience is that React Native is quite good as it is at this moment, and it is going to get better in the future. So I mentioned that you need to evaluate your business requirements in your application. You need to isolate each of the cases. So when I migrated my native applications into React Native application, that is exactly what I did. I identified the business requirements. I identified the pain points of integrating different libraries, and I created different POCs for each of those. And I was quite comfortable with the output of it. And it only took me about 2 weeks to do all of this, evaluate all of the libraries, learn about React and React Native a little, and evaluate the possibilities. So I would definitely say that as it is, even React Native is quite good. The only sort of competition at the moment is Flutter. It's still at very early ages. The only difference between React Native and Flutter is that React Native sort of instructions has to go through a bridge and then has to get translated for the native platform code. But in Flutter, what it outputs is native bytecode. So the performance is quite good in Flutter. So in the future, it might pose a threat. I wouldn't say exactly a threat, but a competition to React Native. But definitely React Native would stay for a long time. Definitely because of the fact that the convenience. I just showed you guys that how easy it is for you to see the changes and do the tests at the same time and get an output. So Lakshmi is asking, as you pointed out, React Native is still a beta, so it is suitable time to migrate enterprise. Yeah, so React Native, the term that I use beta is only a term that I use. They don't exactly call React Native a beta. It's an evolving product. So it evolves quite rapidly, and they have identified some of the core upgrades that they need to do to React Native in order to make it more user-friendly and developer-friendly. So these are the exact problems that the Airbnb team had. So Airbnb team couldn't resolve these issues, and what they are trying to do is resolve these issues within Facebook and then ship out those improvements to React Native. So once those improvements come out, I would say that the React Native as a platform would be even more stable and even more appealing to the developers. So Aushadhi is asking that is it always good to use third-party libraries? How can we make sure this library work is documented? So yeah, Aushadhi, what you need to do is that isolate each of the requirements and do a POC on each of the libraries. See that the library could achieve exactly what you want to achieve. Without doing that, don't integrate that library into a project, because that would be a pitfall and you would have a lot of problems down the line. So I also mentioned that React Native is very basic. So React Native itself can't do everything. That's why we have so many third-party libraries out there. So there are quite famous third-party libraries which is being contributed by so many people. So once you get into React Native development and you have identified your requirements and you start researching on these things, you would know that these libraries are good. So the reason that I didn't mention any libraries in my presentation is because I want you to guys go through this process and identify the libraries yourself so that you know for sure that these are the correct libraries for my project. So you would have to definitely use third-party libraries. If you have any specific requirements in terms of security, you might have to do some thorough testing in these libraries, but definitely you would have to use third-party libraries. Hiran is asking how you compile, deploy App Store, Google Play. So for Expo, I have only done demo projects and I haven't published any applications. But for React, if you use React Native init command line tool, what happens there is that it is going to create two Android Studio as well as Xcode projects. So these projects could be open from Android Studio and Xcode, and they would look and act the same way as just about any other project. So what you have to do is for Android, you could just use the Gradle tool, just assemble a release, have the necessary configurations first, and do assemble release, and you would have the APK. You could just send it out to the Google Play Store. For Apple, just archive the project and you would get the React Native project as an IPA. And I have published my applications on App Store as well, so I can say for sure that there is no problem with having a React Native application published to the App Store. So there are people who are kind of worried that my App Store might reject this. They don't. So we did a project, Jack Ratnaik says, we did a project by using React Native, but it's slower than native. Yeah, so when you are getting into React Native development, you would just go ahead and code your application, and later down the line, the performance would come across. So you need to pay attention to how the application and the components are rendering. So there are different ways. Just having a console log output even would be fine. And there are the tools here that you could use if you are using Redux. There are certain optimizations you can use. Try to minimize the rendering times of your component. If the component doesn't have to render, don't do it. One of the most common cases is that, let's say, for example, you have a list view, and within the list view you have certain components. If the parent component that is containing the list component gets updated, there are certain cases that same update would go into the list, flat list, and in that case the flat list would try to re-render itself. So that means that there is something wrong with how you have passed the data. So pay attention to those. Try to reduce the times the render method is being called in your component. The easiest way is that convert your components into pure components, and then that would do a shallow comparison between the states and the props and reduce the render times. But you might have to go beyond that and do some hard coding stuff. Hard coding as in not writing hard code, but some hardcore stuff. But once you get started with performance optimizations, you would know different topics of how to optimize lists, how to optimize components, how to optimize your navigation routers and things like that. So once you get the ball rolling, you would know how to optimize your React Native application, and pay attention to the JS thread. So there are two different threads running on a React Native application, UI thread as well as JavaScript thread. Most of the time, the JavaScript thread would fall behind if you don't have any optimized code in your React Native application. So pay attention to that and try to improve the FPS on the JavaScript thread. Oshad is asking, can you suggest library for icons in React Native? Most of the people are using React Native vector icons. So what I use is React Native vector icons as well. One of the other things is that once you have that library, it is easier for you to integrate your custom icons as well. How you should do is that you should create a font file with your icons. There are tools available to do that. So if you have developers, if you have graphic designers, just ask them for the SVGs. There are online tools which you could import these SVGs and output a TTF file, import that into your application, through React Native vector icons and then use those icons within your application. Can you compare the lifecycle of Android and iOS? Yeah, so lifecycle is quite different in React Native terms compared to Android and iOS. In Android, the lifecycle is quite complex as well as in iOS, but not as complex as in Android. In React Native, there aren't many lifecycle methods. So you would come across these lifecycle methods in the documentations. So read through those documentations. Quite recently, they discarded most of the lifecycle methods that they had because having those was quite redundant. You could achieve quite a lot of things in a React Native application with less lifecycle methods. So you might have to sometimes watch for mounted state in a component using a custom variable. So basically in component did mount, you would set a variable to true, indicating that the component is mounted, and then component will unmount. In that method, you would have to set it to false, things like that. But it's not very difficult to handle lifecycle methods in a React Native application. So if you pay attention to React documentations, you would know about these methods, and it's quite easy to get a hang of the lifecycle in React Native applications. Yeah, so that's about it for the questions that we have received, and I thank you guys for joining the webinar. I hope you guys have learned something out of this. And quite more importantly, there are plenty of resources available out there how to do the coding stuff, but this is about how to actually get into React Native development, how to make up your mind, and how to avoid any dead ends that you might encounter. Right, guys, thank you for joining. Goodbye.